Okay, I think people are going to keep coming in, but we will make a start because I know, James, you've got a lot to get through tonight. There's lots of really interesting stuff James is going to be talking about this evening. So thanks again, everybody, for joining us, and welcome to this Trees for Life webinar. My name is Kat. I'm the Community Engagement Officer here at Trees for Life, and joining me are my colleague James, who is the Senior Ecologist at Trees for Life, and our colleague Fiona is here as well. She's the Caledonian Pinewood Project Manager. Caledonian Pinewood Recovery Project Manager. Knew I'd miss a word out there. So thanks guys for joining us. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. So I know a lot of people are very familiar with Zoom by now, but just in case you're not, if you hover over the Zoom window with your mouse, you'll see a bar with options that for me appears at the bottom of the screen. For you, it might be somewhere else depending on how you're joining Zoom. But you should see a Q&A function, so question and answer function, and a chat box as well. Lots of you have already found the chat box, which is great. So if you've got any comments, if you want to send messages to any of us or to any of the other people on the webinar, you can send individual messages or you can send messages to everybody. And particularly if you're having any technical issues or anything, if you send a message to me, then I'll do my best to sort that out. But if you have any questions for James or Fiona, please try and keep them to the Q&A box, because then it's much easier for me to keep track of them. We'll be able to answer some of them as we're going through, but we'll probably save the majority of them until the end of the webinar, where James can answer them for us without interrupting his flow as he's presenting. Just be aware that you can upvote questions. If you see them in the Q&A, they're a bit similar to something that you're wanting to know about. That will help us prioritize the questions. So just upvote them by, I think it's a little thumbs up icon, and you can comment on them as well if you want to add something to them. Okay. I will hand over to James at this point. Thank you, James. Really looking forward to this.
Thanks very much, Kat, and thanks everyone for joining. This is a huge crowd, so it'll be really interesting to see how this all goes. I am going to talk to you today about Caledonian Pinewoods, which have been my life for the past 3 years since starting working for Trees for Life. I've surveyed 58 Caledonian Pinewood sites, and I've walked over 500 miles through them, so I'm pretty familiar with them now at this stage. What this presentation is going to cover is really what Caledonian Pinewoods are, where they are, how they're doing, with a real focus on that last bit, so how the Caledonian Pinewoods are doing across the Highlands. And yeah, I guess I'll just get started. So I guess what Caledonian Pinewoods are all about. Sorry, my presentations. There we go. Caledonian Pinewoods are essentially places where there are wild Scots pine in Scotland. And wild Scots pine are trees that have regenerated naturally over, they've self-seeded from the trees that recolonized ultimately after the last ice age. So whenever the ice melted and the landmass of Scotland was available for tree growth again, we had Scots pine recolonizing quite quickly. And we know that there were actually 2 populations of Scots pine that recolonized. One came from the west or southwest, and one came up kind of from the south and from the east. So we had 2 recolonization events, and Scots pine, they're genetically different, those populations, although they're very mixed now. But wild trees are very different than planted trees in some ways, because you get things that look like this, that don't look at all like your stereotypical tree that you would draw whenever, like children would draw their little tree picture. They probably wouldn't draw something like this. It looks like an octopus or something. You get all kinds of really weird wild trees. They grow in really sculptural forms, very variable as well. I mean, you do get wild trees that look like a stereotypical tree, but they have more variability than you typically get in plantations. And obviously they've also come from that original genetic stock that recolonized after the ice age. So they're really important woods because they contain wild Scots pine. And also those wild Scots pine can form a really, really rich habitat for some of our most iconic wildlife. Species like capercaillie, wildcat. We've got the Scottish crossbill, which is an endemic species, only occurs in Scotland. We've got our squirrels, etc. So lots of our iconic wildlife rely on our pine woods. And our pine woods were once much more widespread than they are today. They were a huge part of the natural vegetation in our uplands. And because Caledonian pine woods are made up of these wild trees, which have regenerated over generations and generations in the same sort of rough areas, a lot of them are ancient woodland sites as well. So this is a map from 1750, Roy Highland map, which was a military map of Scotland. And this is a picture of Loch Maree and the islands in it. So you can see all the little wooded pine islands of Loch Maree in 1750. And if you fast forward to today, those same areas are still wooded. So our Caledonian pine woods are mostly ancient woodlands. And that means that a lot of the wildlife that's been lost from the surrounding landscape and might not have been able to recolonize new woodland areas has retreated back to these areas. So they're really important refuges for some of our most threatened wildlife. Caledonian pine woods are restricted to the Highlands of Scotland. As far as we know, Scots pine became extinct across the rest of Britain, except in the Highlands, although there are a few sites where possibly we think Scots pine has clung on outside the Highlands. But the Caledonian Pinewood sites are all found across the Highlands. We've got a big concentration around the Cairngorms, Speyside, Deeside. We have some in the central glens like Glen Affric, Glen Cannock, Glen Strathfara. We have some sites in the northwest and in the north. And then we've got lots of smaller sites in the southwest. And I guess what you'll notice here is that our Caledonian Pinewoods range from massive big sites where there's landscape scale, quite natural vegetation, like in Glen Affric here, where the trees in the foreground stretch right back in a band into the distance. So we have some very big Caledonian Pinewood sites, but we also have some really tiny ones where there's no other pine in this landscape for miles around, except in this tiny little ravine in the northwest. So our Caledonian pinewoods vary in terms of their size and character, but they also vary based on their location. So the Highlands is a very variable place, and the west of Scotland receives much more rainfall than the east. And this is illustrated in this map here, where these peaks indicate higher rainfall, and the lower areas are areas of lower rainfall. So we can see our pinewoods in the Cairngorms receive much less rainfall than the ones in the west. And actually the ones in the west receive so much rainfall that they're actually a form of temperate rainforest, which is like a cold, very wet forest type. So if we look at the pinewoods in the east, we typically find a little bit more juniper than in the west. We find silver birch more so than downy birch. Often the things growing on the trees will be different. So this yellowy kind of powder we can see on this tree is a kind of lichen, and it prefers dry barks. You tend to find it in the east. If we go to the west of Scotland, we tend to find more oak in our pine woods, like this big oak here. The dominant birch species is downy birch instead of silver birch, and you're into that temperate rainforest ecosystem, and you start to find all kinds of absolutely gorgeous liverworts and ferns and mosses, things that really like that high humidity in the west of Scotland. So our Caledonian pinewoods vary ecologically in terms of their location and climate, and they also vary in terms of their size. Oh, I almost forgot, we also have bog pinewoods, and those are areas of pine that are growing on very boggy vegetation, so a lot of sphagnum mosses, a very waterlogged habitat, and they tend to be quite scattered areas of pine that are stunted by the difficult growing conditions. So that's another kind of pinewood that we have. And I should just mention, pine is a species that doesn't like too much competition from other trees. It doesn't like competing with oak, for example, more kind of temperate species, more species associated with southern parts of Britain. So pine kind of finds itself in these quite, in these upland habitats. It finds those its home because other trees don't compete as well there. But there's been this perception that our Caledonian pinewoods are not necessarily doing as well as they could be. And because of that, Trees for Life started the Caledonian Pinewood Recovery project back in 2018, along with our project partners, the Woodland Trust. Forests and Land Scotland, Scottish Forestry, Nature Scot, and Scottish Land and Estates. I think I got them all there. But anyway, the Caledonian Pinewood Recovery Project began in March 2018, and it had three main aims. One of these was to better understand pinewood's health and resilience, which is something that I'm focusing this talk on, and I'll come back to explain a little bit more in a minute. Improving relationships between stakeholders who have an interest in pinewoods, and also to bring more pinewood areas into active management. So these bottom two aims have been, those have been the things that my colleague Fiona has focused on, whereas I focused on trying to better understand the Caledonian pinewood health and resilience. So that's what I'm going to focus on. What does it mean for a pinewood to be healthy and resilient? That's quite a good question. In some ways, these can come across sometimes as buzzwords, but actually a healthy Caledonian pinewood, in very simple terms, is one that can support the full range and abundance of wildlife that you might expect in that habitat type. Whereas a resilient pinewood is one that can recover after a big disturbance event or can maintain itself whenever it's under stress. So say, for example, if a big storm came and blew down all the trees, a resilient pinewood would be able to regrow after that storm, whereas one that wasn't resilient wouldn't regrow. And what we've done during the project is we've looked at really four characteristics of what make pinewoods healthy and resilient. So in general, pinewoods have these four things, which are diversity, is it good habitat? Continuity, is all that diversity there able to perpetuate itself into the future? Mobility, is it free to move around in the landscape? And connectivity, is it big and joined up? Pinewoods that have those four things we consider to be healthy and resilient. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through these four things and talk a little bit more about the thinking behind them and why we've looked at them. So the first one, diversity, is it good habitat? The reason why this is really important in terms of ecological health and resilience is that diverse pinewoods tend to be better able to adapt to disturbance events that wipe out certain individual species. So say, for example, if you had a disease that took out birch, but in your pinewood you had birch and Scots pine and rowan, well, you might lose your birch, but at least you still have some trees there to carry that woodland on into the future. So diverse pinewoods tend to be more resilient. But also the diversity of trees is really, really important. Trees and shrubs, as you can see here, we've got an area of pinewood with Scots pine, which is this conifer with the bluey green needles. We have birch here, we've got rowan, we've got juniper, we've got a little bit of oak. Whenever you see a diverse area of pinewood like this, it typically means it can support more wildlife, because a lot of the wildlife that lives in pinewood and woodlands generally has adapted specifically to eat or to live on certain tree species. So, and specifically certain native tree species. So if you have a pinewood that only has one tree, it's not going to be able to support the full range of wildlife that you might expect. So for example, pine sawflies specialise to feed on pine needles. If you didn't have Scots pine in your pinewood, you wouldn't have pine sawflies and all the other things that need Scots pine. We've got a lovely fungus here growing specifically on juniper, and this fungus alternates its generations between hawthorn and juniper. So if you don't have both of those shrubs in the vicinity, you won't have that fungus. So there's these really tight relationships between the different species that live in this ecosystem. And if you knock out part of it, you're going to lose quite a lot. The other thing that's important in terms of having a diversity of trees is that trees have different bark chemistries and different kinds of bark, and different species grow on different trees. Lots of things live on tree bark, like these big leafy lichens here. And in fact, these leafy lichens, they prefer the bark of trees like rowan and old oak and hazel. So if there aren't any of those trees, you'll probably not get your leafy lichens. And this species here, called lungwort, it actually takes nitrogen from the air and fixes it into a form that can be used by plants. And then that nitrogen, whenever the lungwort falls off the tree, it gets recycled into the soil. And so that's actually a way that the woodland can kind of obtain kind of fertilizer from the air. And we also have some, because we have, some of our pinewoods are temperate rainforest, there's very specialist assemblages of lichens that can grow in some of the trees there. So this is a really beautiful little one, frilly fruited jelly skin. It looks like a little flower. Some of the small stuff growing on the trees is just incredible whenever you actually look at it close up. And that's all part of the diversity of our pinewoods. Another aspect of pinewoods, which is really important to provide good habitat, is the cover and structure of the pinewood itself. So we can see on these islands, we've got Scots pine canopy here. And below it, we've got an undergrowth of juniper, and we've got tall heather and blaeberry and bracken as well. So all of that's providing a lot of structure and shelter for a lot of the species that rely on woodland conditions to thrive. So having those different kinds of layers and different structures is another important habitat component. Another one is old trees, and trees that are old with like deadwood features. So they might have attached branches that are dead, or they might have rock holes in them. Things that we might not think of as being part of a really rich ecosystem are actually incredibly important. We have certain invertebrates that have specialized to feed on the sap run that comes out of certain trees, to feed on the rotten heartwood of trees, all kinds of niches in old trees. And actually our Caledonian pinewoods are really important for old trees, which have been lost from a lot of other parts of Europe due to management, like for commercial forestry, which a lot of the time results in fewer old trees. Along with old trees, another important diversity feature is dead trees. If you think about it, for as long as there have been trees, there have been dead trees. And so loads of things have come to depend on that habitat that it provides. So here we've got a lovely little lizard sitting on a fire-scarred dead Scots pine, sunning itself. But actually some of the lichens growing on the bark here, or on the exposed wood, are specialised to dead wood, and you'll not find them really growing in other habitats. Equally, fallen dead wood, there's loads of fungi that specialise on recycling the nutrients from that back into the forest floor. We have lots of little mosses and liverworts growing on the surface here that you typically only find on dead wood. And eventually whole trees get carpeted in material and just get absorbed into the floor. Moving away from the trees and shrubs of the pinewood, we also have things growing on the ground. All the little wildflowers, grasses, sedges, rushes. Some wildflowers are more important than others for wildlife. Blaeberry, which is shown here, is really a favourite food for deer and for capercaillie. They feed on the shoots of it. It also produces insect-pollinated flowers for our pollinators, like this little bee here. And it produces berries in the autumn to winter time, which are eaten by a range of birds and mammals. So blaeberry is really like a pinewood superfood. And having all those flowers and fruits as well. This is cowberry, another little pinewood dwarf shrub. Having all those fruits and flowers is really important for the ability of that habitat to sustain other wildlife. And we don't just have fruits and flowers on growing amongst the ground vegetation. We also have trees like holly that produce insect-pollinated flowers and fruits. And finally, our last kind of component of that diverse pinewood are wood ant nests. So this big mound here is built by a colony of these little wood ants, and they carry lots of dead material like dead twigs and leaves and stuff. They carry it back and form this big mound, which helps to trap heat inside it. But it's not just wood ants that live in here. There are a whole range of insects that have specialised to fulfil their life cycle partly inside wood ant nests. So if you don't have wood ants, you can't have your pinewood supporting those species. And wood ants also perform a really important role in pinewoods by feeding on different invertebrates that feed on trees, for example. And also they have interactions with sap-sucking insects like aphids. So there's all kinds of things going on there in terms of the interactions that wood ants are important for. So that's a summary of the different aspects of diversity in our pinewood that would allow it to be a really good habitat if all of those things are there at a landscape scale anyway. Moving on to the next characteristic of health and resilience is continuity. Is it able to regenerate? So woodlands don't have to be planted, they grow themselves, as long as the young trees are able to find somewhere suitable to establish on the ground, and are then able to grow up without being adversely impacted by various things. So is that habitat able to regenerate? Habitats that can't regenerate have no way really of recovering after a big disturbance like a storm. If your pinewood is not successfully producing young trees, or won't be able to in response to a disturbance event, your pinewood's going to disappear. So that regeneration thing is absolutely vital to our pinewoods being able to function. And it's also important that each of the different habitat components is able to perpetuate itself into the future, not just the trees. But I guess focusing on the trees makes sense because they're such a vital part of the forest. And here we can see outside a deer fence, we have no young trees. So each tree that dies out here will not be replaced. Whereas inside, we've got a good diversity of young trees, Scots pine and birch. So if an old tree dies here, it'll be replaced. So this is one of the really essential elements of health and resilience. The third one is mobility. Is it free to move around? And this is quite an interesting one. If you think about how our pinewoods recolonized Scotland after the last ice age, the wild trees that came back were able to move through the landscape successfully to adapt to that climate change. The ice sheets disappeared, and so there was lots of free land, and they were able to move in. Today, we're undergoing a period of significant climatic change, and the ability of pinewoods to move in the landscape is important once again, because it's possible that climate change is going to make some areas where pinewoods are today less suitable for Scots pine in future, particularly by influencing the conditions for other trees to grow, like oak, for example, that might eventually outcompete pine on those sites. So mobility is really important with climate change. And here we can see a pinewood with old pines on the horizon and all these young trees that have spread back on their own. So this site has really good mobility. And the last one is connectivity. Is it big and well joined up? Our pinewoods have to be a certain size to be able to support the full range of diversity, because species have certain territory sizes or need pinewood of a certain size to sustain a viable population. But it's more than that. Connectivity, pinewoods being joined up is really important because, again, using the storm analogy, which I'm overplaying now, but if a big storm comes through and knocks down some of your trees, if that knocks out some of the associated wildlife of that pinewood site, and that site was isolated, then that wildlife can't get back. So if you don't have corridors to connect the pinewood, the recovery process won't be complete. You won't get your full range of diversity reforming again after a disturbance event. So connectivity, another really important aspect of health and resilience. So just to summarize those, the things that we've considered in our project: diversity. Is it good habitat? Does it have all those things I talked about, the different trees and shrubs, the different ground vegetation, the dead wood, etc. Continuity. Is it able to regenerate into the future with all the young trees coming up as well, where there's space for them? Mobility. Is it free to move around? And connectivity. Is it joined up? Now, of course, these things themselves don't just exist in a vacuum. They form in response to outside influences or inside influences. So there's different impacts on pinewoods from large herbivores, such as wild deer and livestock, non-native species, fire, disease, fragmentation, and climate change. So I'm going to go through each of these things very quickly, and yeah, just talk a little bit about them. And then we'll come on to some examples of sites that I've looked at, and I'll ask you for some of your thoughts on whether you think it's a healthy and resilient pinewood or not. So the first of these is herbivore impacts. This is a really major influence on our pinewoods. We have natural large herbivores in our pinewoods like red deer and roe deer. We also have some introduced species like sika deer. Deer in Scotland can develop into very large population sizes, and they can also exhibit behaviours that are abnormal at a landscape scale because we no longer have predators in the landscape. So red deer populations, there's some evidence, strong evidence to suggest that that they can be regulated in terms of size and behavior by wolves, whereas roe deer populations can be regulated by lynx. So the apex predators that we've removed from our landscape were very important in creating a really functional system. So in their absence, it's up to us to manage herbivore impacts from wild herbivores like deer, because basically if you don't have those predators, the population expands until it's regulated by the climate instead. And so what you get is mass deer die-offs in wintertime whenever the population explodes and exhausts the amount of vegetation. So it's important for deer welfare as well that we manage our populations of wild herbivores. In terms of their impacts, deer and other large herbivores can cause damage to trees, young trees particularly. So we can see here a ring-barked young Scots pine. So that's probably from deer threshing their antlers on it. But the main impact from deer and other large herbivores really is in how they feed. So here we can see a Scots pine, a young one, and these bits at the end here have been eaten off. So the big luxuriant growth that you would expect has been removed. And of course, it's perfectly normal for deer to feed. Of course they feed. It's really the level of that feeding and its uniformity that's important for the health and resilience of our pine woods. And this is really illustrated whenever you do look along a fence line like this, where you can see how just what an impact the deer and sheep as well in this case are having, where we have no young trees outside and lots inside. It's not just the young trees that large herbivores can impact, it's also the things that grow on the ground. So we can see inside this deer fence, we have loads of blaeberry and cowberry. Those things are producing insect pollinated flowers and fruits as well. Whereas outside we have mostly purple myrgrass, which produces wind pollinated flowers. So that it doesn't support pollinating insects. It doesn't produce fruits. So there's a huge difference in the productivity for wildlife of these two areas based on the grazing pressure here. And this is an illustration of that along a fence line. So inside the fence, we have no large herbivores at present, and outside we have lots. And you can see the contrast in how the blaeberries recovered. This is, I think, within about 12 years. The blaeberries came back, the young trees have come back, and the woodland is in a healthier, more resilient state. Another interesting thing that large herbivores can do, deer are just like us. They prefer to eat certain things. There's things that are tastier to them than others. And whenever deer have a choice of things to eat, a lot of the time they don't really have much of a choice. They'll just eat what they can. But when they do have a choice, perhaps inside a fenced area that's now been opened up, deer can sometimes eat certain things more than others. So here we've got a young Scots pine, which has almost been entirely eaten off. Like almost all of the growth has been taken off this. And so what that means is that if that is repeated each year, that Scots pine will not be able to grow onwards to maturity. It'll just get stuck at that stage and probably eventually die. Whereas the birch here beside it, it's got a lot more healthy shoots that haven't been eaten yet. So whenever deer preferentially feed on some trees over others, you can think over time how that might have consequences for the forest. So in this area, we'll expect the birch will be able to establish and grow up to maturity, whereas the Scots pine won't. So you might end up with a birch wood in future. And this is an illustration of it here along this fence line. Inside the fence, we have Scots pine and birch. Outside, we only have birch. And that's because of something I've termed selective overbrowsing. Selective means that they're picking and choosing what they're eating. Browsing is feeding on woody plants, so like young trees, and overbrowsing's feeding on them at a level where they can't actually get to maturity. So there's really not a balance between the tree growth and the large herbivore population. Moving on from our herbivore impacts, another thing that can influence the health and resilience of pine woods is invasive and non-native species. So here we've got some big pines that have actually died now, big dead pines surrounded by western hemlock, which is a species introduced for forestry from North America. And that's a heavily shade casting tree and it competes with our native trees like Scots pine. And these non-native species can be a bit of an issue because if they remove our native trees, which have lots of specialist things that require them, the specialist things that live on Western hemlock mostly live in North America. So, you know, we've brought the tree over and not all of its associated wildlife. So it makes it poorer for wildlife if our forest gets replaced with non-native species. Another thing that can have a major impact on pine woods is fire. A lot of the stuff that grows on the ground around pine, like heather, is very flammable, so it'll catch fire quite easily. And this is a picture of an area of pinewood where the ground has recently been burnt, and you can see the dead trees here. They've actually died in a previous fire. So fire can have a major impact on health and resilience as well. Disease is something with potential to majorly impact our pine woods. You can just about make out there's like brown shoots on this juniper bush, and this is caused by a phytophthora, which is a kind of pathogen that causes disease, and it can kill juniper. It's an introduced species as well. Sorry, the pathogen's introduced, not the juniper. Disease can be potentially an issue. At the moment, it's not so much of an issue, but there's the potential for us to introduce new tree diseases that could knock out something crucial like Scots pine. The phytophthora, thankfully, doesn't really knock out juniper, it seems. It can just cause some damage to it. But in general, juniper seems to be holding up okay. Fragmentation then, I've already showed you this photo near the start. The area of pinewood in this landscape, we know from old maps, used to be massive. There used to be kilometers of pinewood here. Today, there's only a tiny little sliver along this inaccessible gorge. Fragmentation has a big impact on pinewoods because it reduces the size, obviously, of the site down to a level that it can't sustain all of its associated wildlife. And also, we have climate change. And climate change is, I've talked a little bit about it there. It could potentially affect what species grow well in pinewoods in the future, and might see pine being replaced in some areas if it can't adjust in the landscape by moving up. Yeah, climate change, it's really, to be able to be resilient to that, pinewoods need to be able to move. And climate change causes, it causes that change in the balance between different tree species that might grow in a pinewood. But it also is likely to lead to more extreme weather events, so more extreme disturbances like really heavy winds, or strong winds, sorry. So climate change has the potential to cause a lot of problems in the future and today. So that's a lot of stuff, and I've bombarded everyone a little bit there. Basically, what we then did was we combined all that information. We looked at what can I actually see whenever I'm out there in the pinewood that'll give me clues about these various things. And we put it then onto a recording sheet. So, we're recording the different tree species, their growth stages, the kinds of old trees, the types of deadwood that are present, various things, herbivore impacts, whether there's been a fire recently or not, the ground vegetation and impacts on it. So we record a huge amount of things during the survey to try and untangle this health and resilience aspect of pinewoods. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show a couple of pictures, and I think Kat is able to share a poll with people. It's just really what I would like you to do, I guess, is think about some of the habitat components that make up a pinewood, and think about this picture behind here, and does this pinewood look healthy and resilient? Yeah, I think there's a clear consensus emerging. It's a simple case. Yeah, I'll let people continue voting a bit. So I think we can maybe, I'll maybe just talk through it now. People can still fill in the poll if they haven't, but the consensus is that this is not an area of healthy and resilient pinewood. It's quite obvious in this case. If I was looking at this particular pinewood area, which I have done, we can see that there's lots of the diversity features that are missing. You know, we don't have the living trees and shrubs that are providing habitat for so much stuff. We don't have the canopy cover and the undergrowth. We don't have much flowering and fruiting stuff. We do have the deadwood, which is going to be supporting some of the species of pinewood. But yeah, there's no continuity because there aren't young trees coming along here to replace the dead trees. So yeah, so this area of pinewood, I would say it's not a particularly good habitat. It's also, it's also not able to regenerate at present. We only see dead trees and some living ones on the horizon. And what are the reasons for that? What are the impacts here? And these are a little bit more difficult sometimes to untangle, but we can see here that this area has been recently burnt. We can see the burnt heather here and the fire scars on the pine, this charring. So a big fire has come through here at some point. And whenever you look at the herbivore impact as well, you need to be in the field to do that up close. But you can also see that none of the young trees are able to establish because there's too much pressure from large herbivores at the moment. They're eating the young trees and lots of the other stuff as well. So basically this area of pinewood has been exposed to repeated fire, and the recovery has been prevented by the pressure from the large herbivores. So yeah, that was 97% were saying that wasn't an area of healthy and resilient pinewoods. We've now got a picture of another site. So maybe just take a look at that before we do the poll for it. But yeah, so this looks very different than that last area of pinewood. So I think just the same question again, Kat. If people want to think about whether this pinewood looks healthy and resilient. Yeah, so we've got a similarly, we have a consensus. This time it's around it is healthy and resilient, although there's a little bit more variation. More people are not sure, and there's some people who think it's not. I'm just going to end the polling for that now, just to rattle on. So this area of pinewood, just to talk through it a little bit, is it good habitat? Well, we can see lots of diversity features. We can see there's big birch and big pine, and there's old examples of each species. So there's the old trees. There's also dead trees in amongst this as well. So we're starting to score off a lot of the things that that we'd expect to see in good habitat. You know, we've got different trees and living trees and shrubs, dead wood, old trees. We've got good cover in terms of canopy and stuff. What's really good here as well is that we also have a lot of regeneration, a lot of young trees, and not just young trees of one species, but young trees of Scots pine, birch, also rowan that you can't really make out here. So this is regenerating really well, and it means that this pinewood is really much healthier and more resilient. And if we think about the impacts on this, why is it the way it is? Well, we can see there's a big gap between the old trees and the young trees. So what's actually happened here for a long time is there's been quite a lot of herbivore impacts for a while, or quite a high level of pressure. And then that's been dropped down at some point in the kind of recent past, and that has allowed this entire weave of young trees to pop up and to grow successfully. So yeah, and you can see how it's starting to connect up the separate bits of pinewood as well. So it's improving connectivity. It's also got mobility, so it's able to move up the slope. So yeah, so this pinewood's in a much healthier and more resilient place than the last one. And just another couple of examples. I'll not use a poll for these. Is it free to move around? Here we've got some young pine that are spreading out from the old ones in the distance here. We also have a lodgepole pine, which is a North American species. So in terms of impacts, there's a little bit there from non-native species. But in general, this is a pinewood that is free to move around. It has good mobility. And this one, is it big and joined up? Well, this is just a couple of pine trees hanging on in a ravine in a massive landscape where there aren't other pine trees for miles. So this site's very isolated. If a storm were to come through here and knock those trees down, that would be it. This fragment would be lost completely. And yeah, in terms of impacts, what I found here was that the pressure from large herbivores was too large to allow any of these trees to seed successfully, except inside the ravine, which you can't really see very well. Sometimes there's places there where the herbivores can't reach. So anyway, I have, with all that in mind, and with the thinking behind it, I then had to go out and do the survey work. So as I said, 500 miles, many sites. There's more sites to come as well. Another, it'll bring us up to sort of 72 of the total, which is 72 out of 84 Caledonian Pinewood sites in total. I'll see if I can play this video. It wasn't all glamorous. There were swarms of flies, lots of ticks. I mean, in one way, all those flies are saying, oh, you know, this is great habitat for flies and they're thriving here, but, you know, it's not, wasn't the most pleasant sight to do. Yeah, there's a lot of flies, a lot of ticks at certain times of the year, and really cold weather in winter and stuff. So it wasn't all completely kind of idealistic, but I mean, it was pretty good as far as jobs go. So, and I showed you the survey sheet before. We ended up doing 865 of these. Each survey sheet corresponds to a half-acre plot, which is, from what I gather online, half a football field. So that's the kind of scale that we basically went to Caledonian Pinewood sites. We had these plots pre-mapped out, and then I would go to them and I would, within that space, record all those things that could give us clues about the health and resilience. So based on the information that we got back, we're able to start answering some of these questions about health and resilience. So just a reminder, our 4 things again: is it good habitat, able to regenerate, move around, joined up? Before I go into these in any detail, I should just say, this has been a massive piece of analysis and I can only present like the kind of headline things here. So there's a lot more detail I could go into, but I've got 15 minutes. So I will rattle through. And first of all, there's a lot of variation in our pinewood sites. Some of the sites are big and joined up and regenerating, pretty healthy and resilient, like this one here. The pines on the other side of this loch are actually joined right round the loch to these pines over here, and we've got good diverse regeneration. So we have some areas of pinewood that are like this, that we're thinking, great, you know, this pinewood is going to be well suited for the future. We have other sites that are a bit more like this, where, you know, the situation is pretty dire. The pines that are dying are not being replaced. There's hardly any canopy cover. A lot of our diversity features have already been lost. So there's a huge amount of variation. And the variation isn't just between sites, it's also within sites, which I'll come on to. So in terms of diversity, is it good habitat? Just a reminder of some of the things that were considered here: the different native trees and shrubs, the different tree surfaces that the lichens grow on, cover and layering, old or veteran trees, dead trees, the ground vegetation, flowering and fruiting, wood ant nests. I don't think I really have time to go into detail about any of these things. I'll just, in general, the variety of native trees and shrubs, the average was about 3.6 per plot. So that was the number of different native trees and shrubs that were found. But a significant part of that was held at the early growth stage by the pressure of deer feeding or livestock feeding. So those trees aren't able to grow up to become big trees at the minute. So that's kind of a bit of an issue. So some of the diversity is trapped at that early growth stage. And that in turn limits the kinds of tree surfaces that are available for lichens. It limits the cover and layering. It limits the diversity of old and veteran trees, and eventually dead trees. We also found, old and veteran trees in less than half of plots, so they're relatively scarce. Wood ant nests were the scarcest thing of all, found in only 6% of our plots. And flowering and fruiting and the ground vegetation's generally quite influenced by herbivore impacts. So the overall picture for diversity, is it good habitat? Generally, our pinewoods are not meeting their potential in terms of what the habitat they could provide, although there are some areas where the habitat it's pretty good. But yeah, again, a variable thing. Continuity is able to regenerate very quickly. There were some areas where Scots pine was threatened with complete loss quite imminently. That was in 13% of plots, and in 7% of them, it was retreating into like little inaccessible places like cliffs and ravines where large herbivores couldn't reach. So continuity is compromised in some places. And if we look at, rather than Scots pine being able to persist, if we look at the amount of Scots pine there is, the cover is decreasing a lot in about a quarter of the plots, but it's increasing a lot in 18%. So a varied picture between and within sites. Mobility, is it free to move around? I found that there was good mobility in 23% of plots. So in some areas, Scots pine is successfully moving in the landscape and will hopefully be more resilient to climate change. Connectivity, is it joined up? Only 10% of our sites are greater than 500 hectares in size. 500 hectares is equivalent to something like 1,200 football pitches. 500 hectares is important because species like capercaillie, the big bird that lives in pine woods, tends to only be found in sites that are of that size or bigger. So the fact that only 10% of our sites are that big means that our pine woods are quite limited just by their size alone. We also find that in some parts of the country, there are commercial Scots pine forests, particularly around the Cairngorms, and that helps to join up some of these pine wood sites for certain species. It won't help for the species that need old trees and dead wood, for example, necessarily, but it will help for some of the more general species that only need the cover. Whereas away from Deeside and Speyside, which are around the Cairngorms, it tends to be Sitka spruce as the main species used for forestry. So there's a bit of a difference in the connectivity it can provide. Why are our pine woods not doing better? It's important to emphasize that there are some sites where these things are really good, and there's parts of sites where we see there's all of those signs of health and resilience. But the biggest factor in terms of why our pine woods are not really really healthy and resilient, it comes down to the herbivore impacts. These were high in 57% of plots. They were only low in I think it was 17% of plots or something. So in general, our Caledonian pinewoods are exposed to high levels of feeding by the likes of deer or livestock. I should just say deer are by far the main species now found in our pinewoods. Sheep were only found on something like 20% of sites, cattle in a much smaller proportion still. So it's mostly just deer. And because of that, we have lots of deer fencing. 19% of our Caledonian pinewood is now enclosed within deer fences. And in a lot of places, that's allowing the pinewood to start to recover from that pressure. But it also means that a lot of our sites now, before they were like big, they were all like the same management applied across the whole site. So you could look at it and you could say, okay, well, the whole site's maybe not healthy and not resilient, or the whole site's healthy and resilient. Whereas now we have little parcels inside deer fences that might be recovering, whereas outside there isn't the recovery. So because only 20% of the pinewoods are fenced in terms of the overall area, the fencing doesn't fully cover a lot of sites. So that's, I guess, a bit of an issue in terms of us making sense of it. But also, yeah, in terms of deer fences constrain the mobility of a site. So the regeneration can obviously only go to the edge of the fence and not beyond in most cases. The other interesting thing inside deer fences, you can see here, there's actually a track on the inside of this fence created by deer. A lot of fences have deer inside them. So they might have kept deer out for a while, but the deer have now got in. The deer here are trying to get out. That's why they created this track along the edge of the fence, but they're trapped inside. And actually, 52% of the plots inside fences had high impact from large herbivores. So fencing's not necessarily delivering the reductions in pressure that we might expect it to. There's also examples of landscape scale management without fences, so landscape scale management of the deer. And in general, these sites are recovering their health and resilience where the deer management's at a sufficient level to reduce the pressure enough. And on those sites, we also find that way beyond the pinewood boundaries, we find trees sometimes kilometres away, the odd tree. But this is an example of Montian scrub habitat forming, which is another. So normally you would have had the pine woods, and then above that you would have had this Montian scrub layer, like in the if you imagine a mountain. So you've got maybe your oak woods at the bottom into pine woods into Montian scrub. Montian scrub benefits from this as well. Other habitats benefit from it because obviously if you're managing the deer at a landscape scale, it's going to have those landscape scale benefits. Moving on to non-native species, they were found in 20% of plots, but they're mostly scattered and young at the moment, so they're not really causing very negative impacts, but there's the potential once they grow up and mature for them to spread further and for them to have much bigger impacts on our pine woods. There's places where the managers have been diligently removing the non-native species, like this rhododendron here, although there's often a little bit of regrowth, so it's important to kind of to realize that you can't just get rid of these things easily. You have to keep on managing for a while until you really get rid of them. And moving on to fire, evidence of past fire at 41% of sites, recent burning at 28%, but usually only over small areas. The real problem with fire can sometimes create a good seed bank for Scots pine to regenerate onto, or a seed bed, sorry. But the main problem is whenever you burn an area, or an area burns, and then there's also high herbivore impacts, because the herbivores then eat all the young trees that would come up after a fire naturally. So that's where you get the real kind of issues with fire. Although fire itself does also cause a lot of tree mortality, it can remove things like juniper from the undergrowth as well. Climate change, we've talked about how that's related to the ability of trees to move uphill and adjust in the landscape. It's related to how mobile those woods are. And we found that we had mobility in 23%, good mobility in 23%. So it's generally insufficient, except where landscape scale deer management's underway. So our pine woods are potentially quite vulnerable to climate change impacts if those are large. Disease. Dophostroma is a kind of disease that occurs on Scots pine and lodgepole pine as well. There's a risk that the lodgepole strain could spread or hybridize with Scots pine strain and create a problem. So lodgepole pine has been removed from around a lot of pine woods, but often you have to have that follow-up clearance of any young lodgepole pines coming up. In general, there's low exposure to disease at the moment, but resilience is relatively low because tree and shrub richness is constrained by selective overbrowsing. So the diversity of trees is not what it could be, and that means if a disease knocks out a single tree, it's going to have a much bigger impact than if there were more species of tree there in the first place. And finally, fragmentation. This place was described as a mighty park of nature by the early mapmaker Timothy Punt in the 1590s, I think. Whereas now there's only the odd tree left. So a lot of our pine woods have become much more fragmented, and that's due to a combination of potentially climate change, although I think more important has been felling the pine woods followed by the heavy grazing and browsing, which prevents them from regrowing again. And you can see some sites where we find loads of Scots pine stumps all around with just a few pines left. So yeah, you can really see that fragmentation. And just a quick little note about some of the change that have happened in our pine woods. So I'm obviously not the first person to look at our pine woods, other people have as well. Back in the 1950s, this book was written based on visits to lots of the Caledonian Pinewoods in Scotland, written by Stephen and Carlisle. And what I did was compared some of the things they wrote about with some of the things that we found. Some areas of old woodland they described have been lost to commercial forestry and fire since the 50s. There's now a lot fewer livestock in our pine woods than there was in the past. Most of our pine woods would have been grazed by like sheep and cattle as well as deer. Now it's mostly just deer. There's a lot more deer fencing now as a consequence. There's more regeneration now than there was back then. And there's been some conversion of these wild pine woods to native species plantations, so tree planting within them. We also found that the pine woods are not all suffering from the same kind of impacts. In the southwest, this circled area of pine woods here, this is the area that's kind of most threatened at the moment. So as the poorest continuity and mobility, poor connectivity, Scots pine itself is being selectively browsed out. So the deer are preferring to feed on it than other trees like birch. Management is heavily reliant on relatively small fenced areas that don't cover whole sites. So maybe this is somewhere that needs to be prioritized in future, potentially. And finally, this is the last slide. I'm just about going to make it in the hour without losing my voice. The big picture at our Caledonian Pinewoods is that there is now a lot of management. It's widespread across a lot of sites. Loads of land managers are doing something for their pine woods, but it is compartmentalized. It's not necessarily across the whole site. You know, a deer fence tends to be, there might be 1 or 2 deer fences, or 3 or 4 even, but they're in different compartments and they might not fence off. They might only fence half the site, for example. This management is enhancing health and resilience locally, but it's not always as effective as we might expect because we find deer inside a lot of deer fences, for example. Many areas are still declining. Some are at a really critical stage, and sites in the southwest generally need the most help. There are, however, now some really exemplary sites, mostly around the Cairngorms, where there's sufficient landscape scale deer management for a lot of these health and resilience characteristics to emerge. And that deer management is really the key thing there. And we still have a way to go towards healthy and resilient Caledonian pinewoods overall. And that's me. Thanks very much for sticking by and listening. And yeah, I'm happy to take any questions. So feel free to fire into the comments box. And Kat, if you maybe want to select some, I'll try my best to answer them. I might not be able to do them all.
Thank you, James. That was fascinating and also perfectly timed. Well done. Yeah, we've got quite a few questions that have come in throughout, and they're still coming in. Fiona's managed to get through a few, so thanks for that, Fiona. And as James said, we will try and get through as many as we can, but we may not be able to get through them all. And you might find that some questions have already been answered that cover yours as well. So check out the answered section as well. So the one that's got the most votes at the moment is from Liam, and he's asked how many species are solely dependent on Caledonian pinewoods.
Oofed. I'm afraid I'm not sure the answer to that. Caledonian pinewoods, it's probably not that many species that are solely dependent on it, because obviously we have some quite old pine plantations as well. So a lot of the things that rely on old Scots pine, they might have now been able to be supported in those old pine plantations. Also, there's overlap between pine woods and other habitat types like birch woods. So a lot of the things that live on the birch or on the juniper can also live on birch and juniper outside Caledonian. I guess what Caledonian pinewood often does is bring a lot of these elements together, but there's not that many species that solely depend on it. Species that solely depend on old pine and Scots pine in particular. Again, I'm not sure the exact figure for that, but yeah, there's a significant number of rare species that depend on Scots pine. Whenever I was formulating some of these concepts around diversity and stuff, I went and looked at the list of threatened species associated with pine woods. A lot of them rely on the dead and decaying wood. That's a particularly important feature. And then obviously a lot of the species also rely on the living Scots pine itself. But yeah, I'm not sure
Thank you, James. That's a good answer to a very difficult question there. I think it varies according to so many different factors. So the next one that has quite a lot of votes is from Mark. This is an interesting one, actually. He's asked other changes people can make to their own consumer habits that affect the Caledonian pinewood positively. Another tricky one.
That's an interesting question.
Sorry, James, I'm just going to butt in there and say that I tried to type an answer to that one, and it's a difficult one to answer. So I ended up leaving it. So I'm interested to see what you say, because I was not quite sure.
Okay, well, I think the context of Caledonian pinewoods in Scotland is kind of weird compared to other habitat types. Pardon me, Caledonian pinewoods mostly occur on big estates. And as such, the main form of management has traditionally been deer stalking on those estates. And so they're quite, Caledonian pinewoods are relatively insulated from market forces. They tend to be either owned by NGOs, like RSPB have some sites, National Trust for Scotland, Trees for Life, or Forest and Land Scotland, or they're owned privately by often large landlords, so people who are relatively wealthy. So there's not really that much that we consume from those places that influences Caledonian pinewood. I guess one possibility is wild venison. In the absence of natural predators, eating deer, I mean, it makes sense in terms of how to manage the population in some way. However, even just buying more wild venison does not necessarily translate into better deer management at pinewood sites, because you also have deer farms as well that can encourage and stuff. So I'd say in general, consumer habits, there's not really much that we can do. Which sounds a bit depressive, I guess. The political process is the main arena for, just showing appreciation for our pinewoods, treating them as the iconic habitats they are, and expecting them to be managed well are probably the best things that we can do to help them.
Just to add to that, a couple of other people asked questions about fire, and this question brought them back to me, because there are sometimes issues with people having fires in parts of the Caledonian pinewood. I know that's a problem in the summer around the cairngorms, for instance. So just being careful about where you have barbecues, taking barbecues away with you, making sure fires are out, not having them when it's really dry, or that kind of thing also can really help.
That's brilliant. Thanks so much, Kat. Just another thing, whenever you say that, pops into my head is that some of the species of Caledonian pinewood are threatened by disturbance. So capercaillie, for example, their main strongholds are around the cairngorms, but people kind of going off the paths during the nesting season, particularly if they have dogs. Capercaillie are ground nesting birds, and so that's a major pressure on them. So anyone who's visiting the cairngorms during the capercaillie breeding season, which is really any time now through to the end of summer, whenever they're rearing the chicks, it's best to stay on the paths.
And keep dogs on leads, I guess, in areas where they might be breeding. Yeah. Great. So next question is from Ewan, and he's asked, he would be interested to hear about why decaying wood is so heavily managed at the moment, and how to go about changing that at local policy level.
So dead and decaying wood is not heavily managed within most of our pinewoods. The pinewoods have, a lot of them, they have a history of being exploited for timber and stuff, but that mostly happened a few hundred years ago. So a lot of our pinewoods have had this period of recovery where they've started to, develop a lot of old trees again. There are exceptions. Some sites are still managed for commercial forestry, and that's not necessarily in conflict with producing more old dead trees and decaying wood, as long as the forestry is carried out in a sensitive way. But yeah, in general, Caledonian pinewoods are pretty good for dead and decaying wood. That we have quite a few old trees in them, even though old trees are we only find them in 45% of plots. That's pretty high for most woodland types in Britain or Ireland, or most of Northwest Europe, I suspect. So yeah, the pinewoods have been mainly valued as, I guess, as for their amenity value because we care about them, and also as deer shelter. So that's meant that trees haven't mostly been harvested from them in a long time. In other forest types, deadwood is maybe not allowed to accumulate because of commercial forestry. The main issue there is with clear felling of woodlands, because that, if you cut down all the trees in an area, that doesn't leave behind any trees to become old. So that's, I guess, a pressure elsewhere. And I mean, around urban areas, there's still some people still want deadwood taken out of the way because they see it as untidy or whatever. But yeah, not really an issue in the Cale pines.
Thanks, James. Another James has asked, he said, this overview has been fascinating and he's curious to know what day-to-day work typically involves doing for you.
Right now, it has involved a lot of office work. We've been writing a final end project report, which has taken up loads of time and energy, but really good to get all that stuff down on paper. Whenever I was doing the kind of survey report cycle, basically maybe about 40% or 30% of your time was spent surveying the woods, and then the rest of the time was spent writing up that survey information. So you would go out to a site, maybe if you were doing a bigger site, it might last like a week, the survey, smaller sites, a day or 2 days. Go and do your plots, stay out near the pinewood while you're doing that, then come back to the office, write up the report, and then try and get out to the next site. So that's what most of the 3 years of working on the project have been. At the start, there was the period of kind of coming up with our way of surveying the pinewoods and thinking about health and resilience as well, doing a lot of research. But yeah, most of the project day to day was go out and survey lots and then write it up.
Great, thanks, James. Mandy has asked, is there potential for a non-native species to coexist and potentially develop a relationship with the native flora and fauna?
Interesting question. I mean, some of the non-native species, Scotland occur with Scots pine elsewhere in its range. So like Norway spruce can occur with Scots pine in Norway and other parts of Europe. So Norway spruce, it shares some of the species between Scots pine. Like a lot of the things, there are some species that specialize only on one tree species. So like some invertebrates will only eat pine needles, for example, or certain things will only eat, or fungi will only break down the wood of pine. So those things, you can't help them with non-native species at all. There are other species which are more generalist, or they share a few species that they'll use for food, and they can adapt to non-native species. In general, the more distant geographically the species is from, the less chance that it's going to provide very good habitat. So like if you plunked a eucalyptus from Australia in the middle of a pinewood, there'd be very few things that could feed on that. Whereas if you plunked a Norway spruce in there will be quite a few that can transfer from the pine onto it. So it varies. Non-native species, it's not this absolute thing. And non-native species can do lots of stuff. Like, I mean, if we break down the habitat components, non-native species can deliver that kind of cover and shelter for other wildlife. But really, if you want to support the full range of life, you want mostly native species. The other difficulty with non-native species is that we don't know how much they'll spread necessarily in pinewoods. Like at what state, like would they get to the stage where they really outcompete all of the native trees? Or will they reach a state where you maybe find one every 10 meters or something, but it's not removing all of the other species. So there's that difficulty with predicting how the system will play out with non-natives in the long term.
Thanks, James. Question from Kate. I think we might have a similar one in answered actually, but she's asked, would this selective overbrowsing happen less if there were natural population control for the deer?
I think yes is probably the answer to that. we know that where there are wolves and red deer together, for example, that the wolves influence red deer behavior. People talk about the landscape of fear, which is this concept that whenever deer behave differently in the presence of apex predators like wolves, and so they're more alert, they will use the landscape in a different way. At the moment, something that really kind of surprised me whenever I started doing the survey work was how deer basically fan out and cover an entire landscape, rather than, if you reduce their numbers down, they don't just like restrict themselves to certain bits of the landscape in response. You know, you don't get, say if you had 10 deer per square kilometre and you reduced it to 5 deer per square kilometre, those 5 deer would not just, you know, they wouldn't just span half the area. They would span out to the whole area, but they would only feed on certain things. They might stop feeding on the heather because it's not as tasty. They might stop feeding on the birch because it's not as tasty, or the Scots pine because it's not as tasty. So if that landscape of fear means that our large herbivores would be kind of corralled more in the landscape, sticking to certain places rather than fanning out completely, I think you would, a lot of that selective overbrowsing would be overcome. So you wouldn't, if the deer were concentrated in certain areas rather than just, you know, basically what they're doing at the minute is it's like a big tin of sweets where you go in and you have your favorite one and you go right through it to try and get every single one of those first before you eat the other ones, or at least I do. It's the same with the deer. Like, they're going around the landscape eating every rowan tree rather than eating the Scots pine beside it, because the rowan's just tastier. So I think if the apex predators were corralling the deer in certain ways, and keeping them to certain parts of the landscape more, and the deer were avoiding other places, that would make a big difference.
That's really interesting, that it's not just about the predation, it's about the changes to the behavior of the prey as well. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
Thanks, James. Alison has asked, are you suggesting that no human intervention in planting is best, and that preventing herbivore predation is the only way to allow natural regeneration? Have there been any examples of human recreation of native Scots pine forests?
So there's been a lot of planting of native species in Scotland recently in quite large plantations that are designed to somewhat mimic what people think a natural wood looks like, I guess. There are differences structurally in what those woods might look like in the future. You know, you can often tell what a planted wood is versus a natural wood. Even if that plantation was, like, you know, 100 years old or something, you can still see that it's quite different. Humans, whenever they plant trees, they also have to reduce the deer population or restrict deer access by putting up fences. If you went out and planted a tree into, you know, somewhere in the Highlands today that wasn't fenced, in most places that tree would get eaten, and so it wouldn't be able to establish. So the planting and excluding or reducing the deer access is like an integral thing that goes hand in hand. So you can't really do one without the other, except in places where in places where the deer are already being managed at a landscape scale. If you planted a tree there, it would probably do fine. But often what you find in those places, whenever you reduce the deer population down enough, you just start to see trees coming up everywhere. Not necessarily everywhere. I mean, it depends on the distance to existing trees, because it depends on how much seed is falling in that ground. It depends on the level of disturbance there, because sometimes the seedlings can struggle to compete with the surrounding vegetation. But in general, reducing the herbivore pressure around existing pine woods is all that's needed. But yeah, having said that, you can plant areas of pine wood away from existing pine woods. I would say that that's not as ecologically useful as reducing pressure around our existing pine woods, because if you plonk a new area of woodland on like a random hillside somewhere, a lot of the species that live in the old woods can't actually migrate to it if they're not connected. So the best place to put new trees is within and around our existing woods. And our woods are generally quite good at planting themselves once that pressure is brought down enough. So I think something I learned over the course of the project was that, I've got much greater faith in natural regeneration now than I did at the start. having seen it in action inside so many deer fences and in quite a few landscapes as well. I hope that answers your question.
There's another one that's related to that actually from Pippa, who has asked, do you have an ideal deer stocking number for optimum regeneration?
So at the moment, the estates where they're achieving the best kind of the best landscape scale regeneration are managing their deer down to a level of roughly about 2 per kilometre squared, which is lower than they would be naturally. I think the reason why, part of the reason why we have to do that to get the good regeneration to go down to a lower number is because the landscape's kind of been depleted by very heavy or high herbivore impacts for a very long time. So it means that a lot of the really tasty things have been removed completely from the landscape. And so the landscape is basically less nutritious for the deer than it was in the past. So to kind of get over that hurdle, we have to reduce the deer down a bit more than would be natural. To allow, and ultimately that's good for the deer in the long run because they get their tasty vegetation back, which they prefer to eat anyway, and that allows them to put on more weight and just kind of be in better health, less likely to starve in winter. So yeah, 2 per square kilometre is I guess roughly optimal. That's not to say that'll work everywhere. In some places, you could have higher deer numbers where the vegetation is more productive. And you would still be getting quite low impacts. In other places, you might need to go even lower than that. So roughly 2 per square kilometre that's not just to get regeneration, that's to get diverse regeneration. You can go to maybe about 4 per square kilometre and get some regeneration of certain species, but not others.
Thanks, James. Okay, we've got quite a few with the same number of votes. I'm going to go for this one. We've had a couple of questions actually on the subsoil community. So this one is the subsoil community sufficiently well understood and valued? And once a forest is lost, the re-establishment is presumably influenced by the lack of this and the time taken to grow.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think that we don't know enough about pinewood soils. I mean, we do know that they're very fungi are incredibly important in pinewood soils. Like they don't tend to have earthworms. It's mostly fungi that are doing a lot of the work in terms of decomposing stuff. You've got all kinds of mycorrhizal fungi. My understanding is that once an area of pinewood is cleared or kind of falls apart, the mycorrhizae, the fungal communities that are associated with that soil disappear quite quickly. Within a few years, really, because they need tree roots to attach to. And for them to re-establish, it's true that that it probably is, it makes it more difficult for woodlands to re-establish once you've removed that community. Having said that, if you do the kind of landscape scale deer management, what you'll find is that wherever the trees have retreated to, like in little ravines or on crags or wherever, they just start to march out from there. So they spread out from those refuges because the mycorrhizae are spreading out as well. So actually, if you achieve woodland expansion by doing that kind of landscape scale deer management, it allows you to take that stuff with it, and you don't have to use things like, I mean, if you're planting trees today in Scotland, often, you have to use fertilizer to allow them to establish in the first place, or to make them grow at the rate that people want them to. Whereas if you have wild trees spreading out from refuges, there's already all the soil stuff there, and it can spread out with it. But yeah, I would say that we still have a lot to learn about pinewood soils, and it was something that it should really be one of those other diversity features that I mentioned at the start, because loads of stuff lives in the soil. But it wasn't something that we really had time to look at during the survey.
Yeah, so just to come in there, James, there was an earlier question which asked about why the soil wasn't included in our diversity factors, and I answered on the basis you've just said that within the context of this project, we unfortunately weren't able to really include that in what we were surveying or measuring. But that didn't mean that we don't understand that it's really, really important. It's just that we couldn't do it for this particular project, and your presentation today was really based around what we did for this project specifically.
Yeah. Yeah, that's it. I mean, there's always, you kind of have to make calls and stuff on like at the start of the project, I would have loved to have sampled invertebrate communities directly rather than, you know, just basing it on the vegetation. But ultimately, you do, there are correlations there. Like, I mean, if you have a diversity of different trees, you're probably supporting more species of fungi in the soil, because again, you've got some level of specialization there. So I'd say that tree diversity is a bit of a proxy maybe, but yeah, it would have been nice to look at that, but it wasn't practical, I'm afraid.
You should have seen the list he had at the start of the project, people. You should have seen the list of stuff he wanted to do.
Lots of potential for future research.
Yep.
Which is always
and we are looking at research in mycorrhizae at Dundragon. So there's little projects going on there, which will hopefully inform future work.
I think Jill mentioned that in her presentation on the nursery last month. So if anyone hasn't seen that, it is on the YouTube channel. I'll put another link in the chat actually to that soon for you. So we've had a question from Debbie who says, does alder have a place in the pinewood ecology?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Alder is, you sometimes find these old alders amongst pinewoods, particularly along streams and stuff. You know, the alder would definitely have been part of the pine community, in that you know, you would find it along streams that run through pinewoods, or on sloped areas where there's a lot of flushing of water coming down them. But what alder really likes is it likes short sward or disturbed soil to establish in. So it's perfect for floodplains where, you know, you get your sand being deposited or the alluvium being deposited around the river. And so that's perfect for the alder to colonize. And then you kind of grade into pinewoods, maybe on the slopes above that, or maybe some pine mixed in. In pinewoods, you can mimic that to a degree by very heavy grazing. So if you have very heavy grazing and then you suddenly remove that, you could have grazed down the sward to an extent that alder can now regenerate outside the floodplain onto the, you know, into parts of the pinewood as well. So I'm not sure how natural that is, or, you know, that's a constant wonder is what the, you know, well, not whatever natural really means, but what would naturally have been found in pinewoods versus what's there because of how we've managed them. But yeah, I do see alder occasionally in pinewoods, sometimes very big old alder trees, often worked. So they've been pollarded at some point, which means people have cut off their top branches to use for fuel or fodder or whatever. So yeah, some of our pinewood sites, well, a lot of them are parts of like wood pasture systems to a degree. So people have grazed livestock in them in the past, and so some of the species that are there reflects that.
Thanks, James. Jocelyn has asked, are there or could there be similar pinewoods in certain areas of England?
Yes, I think there could be, and there would have been in the past. I mean, we know that pine was abundant in the past in really across Britain, and then as the climate changed, as more temperate species came in, like oak and beech and lime and etc., pine was replaced on the kind of richer soils, and it retreated onto the poorer soils at top hills and stuff. Also on bogs, where it could, you know, outcompete others, or where other stuff couldn't outcompete it. Basically, in England, there's similar upland areas to the Highlands. There's no reason why pine couldn't re-establish there. It's just been lost over time because of various impacts. So yeah, and I mean, there are potentially sites where pine has survived in England. There's one in Northumberland where people think some of the pines might be genuinely wild pines, and some people have suggested some bits of the New Forest as well, bogs in Wales. There's a cliff in Wales that I know that some people are interested in as potentially a pine refuge. Some of the pinewoods in other places might have been different than the ones in Scotland. In Scotland, you know, we've got more kind of northern species that are associated with alpine and Arctic environments. So yeah, the pinewoods further south might have been a bit different. And actually, if you go to Ireland, there's a pinewood on limestone pavement at the Burren, which is in the south, well, the west of Ireland. And the Burren's this big limestone landscape, and the pinewood's growing on it somewhere, which research has now shown likely to be a natural pinewood that survived in Ireland. And it's completely different than the Scottish sites ecologically. I mean, it's the only thing it really has in common is pine. So yeah, so there would have been more kinds of pine communities in the past. The ones in the Highlands are typically on very acidic soils, where there haven't been other species haven't been able to compete with them. But no reason why they shouldn't be in England.
Good to know. Louise has asked, we'll have lots of tourists and local visitors visiting the Highlands and Cairngorms this year. What would the impact of a large-scale human-caused fire in, for example, Abernethy or Glentana be?
Oofed. Yeah, interesting question. I mean, fire is a very variable thing. It depends on the it depends on the fuel load. So if you have like lots of tall heather, which or lots of juniper, for example, those are things that will burn quite readily whenever there's a dry spell. So a big fire there could spread very quickly. Those estates in particular, I don't know, they probably have fire plans in place to help to deal with that, to limit the extent of a fire. But what a fire basically does is it burns through the ground vegetation. It can clear a lot of the undergrowth, like juniper, for example. And if it spreads into the canopy, so not all fires become canopy fires, but if a fire spreads into the canopy, that's whenever it kills a lot of the Scots pines. Fires have a natural role in the ecosystem because they generate these standing dead pine trees, which are loved by certain lichen species, and certain things depend on them. There is a natural kind of fire cycle in pinewoods. It's just that fires would be very infrequent, and they would be they wouldn't be occurring repeatedly like might happen whenever humans create fires. In general, I'd say a big fire somewhere like that would be overall a bad thing, given that old trees are already relatively limited and we don't want to lose more of them at the moment. We typically have, we've got deadwood in 80% of our plots, so we're not too worried about it, although it would be good to further increase it. It would probably, if it spread into the canopy, it could kill a lot of the trees, generate a lot more deadwood. The key thing at the site, though, is how much grazing pressure there, or how much herbivore pressure there is, because if that's too high, that's whenever the fire becomes really destructive, because you don't get any recovery to follow it. So some of the sites in the Cairngorms, there's that landscape scale deer management, and so we would expect recovery to follow. So you'd probably get woodland would regrow afterwards, but you would lose a lot as well.
Thanks, James. You've been answering questions for half an hour now. Are you?
Yeah, I think if we just take maybe a couple more questions and then wind it up. But yeah, thanks everyone so much for all your engagement. It's great that people are so interested and asking really good questions. And yeah, things that I'm just like playing out in my head as there's a bit of that going on. But yeah.
I'm afraid I've left you some of the difficult ones, James. I've been answering the ones that are a little bit easier on the text, eh?
Yeah.
Okay, what to go for? I'm sorry to everyone who we're not going to get to, but you might find more information on our website as well. This is difficult. Nick has asked, with the absence of the actions of herbivore megafauna, does established Caledonian pine forest benefit from human management in the same way lowland woodlands do? And could the large-scale regeneration of the Caledonian pine forest be beneficial, therefore, for local economies, in addition to ecotourism?
Wow, that's a big question. Megafauna in pinewoods, red deer, roe deer, I guess, to an extent, maybe not that big. Aurochs, which were the wild cattle, like all of those things would have naturally spent time in pinewoods. I think it's important to distinguish between, spending time in pinewoods or maybe not going everywhere. Like at the moment, we have deer kind of fan out, like I was talking about earlier, and they cover the entirety of a site. That might not have happened as much in the past. There might have been areas that weren't very heavily herbivore impacted, or only had deer or aurochs coming through every few years. So I think it's unclear what the role of large herbivores would have been. And in pinewoods, fire is a really important disturbance factor, and we know that from the paleo record as well. So fire might have been much more important than large herbivores in generating openings in the forest and things like that. I mean, having said that, there's a whole host of wildlife that's associated with large herbivore dung, for example, and carrion. So if those things were in pinewoods, then that would have been part of the wildlife. In terms of human disturbance benefiting pinewoods, generally in the Caledonian pinewoods, I don't think it's particularly useful. In the current context, where we have quite high deer numbers in some places, actually human disturbance is useful. Like if you have a path through a wood, you can see that the regeneration sometimes starts coming up around the path because the deer are avoiding that area. It's almost part of the landscape of fear if enough people are coming through it. So in that specific context, there's certain impacts that can be useful. In general, I'd say, obviously it's now up to us to manage the large herbivore population. So that's a very beneficial human impact. In terms of benefiting local economies and stuff, I mean, pinewoods can do loads of things. Like if we had bigger, more extensive landscape scale pinewood and other woodland types, there's potential to exploit that for forestry in quite a sustainable way, not clear felling in large areas. The more of that kind of woodland that we have, the more benefits we can probably derive from it. And there's no reason why there couldn't be some grazing in pinewoods in Norway, where the woodlands have largely recovered from past impacts. People now can graze sheep and deer, or sheep and cattle amongst them, without the same level of impact as that would have in the Scottish context. So there's potential exploitative things, like we could take stuff from pinewoods and get economic benefit. But I guess the biggest economic benefits are probably in terms of just having the pinewoods there and people wanting to come and see them and wanting to spend time in them, wanting to spend time in a really rich landscape. Also, of course, there's all of the deer stalking associated with pinewoods and hunting. There's no reason why that can't have a place in a really kind of healthy and resilient landscape with our pinewoods. With deer being managed at an appropriate level. So I think like there's loads of economic opportunities associated with our pinewoods. I'd say Caledonian pinewoods themselves, where we've got our old trees and like really valuable rare species and stuff, it's better to minimize human impacts except for reducing herbivores, for now anyway, just because some of these sites are quite small now, and you could potentially do them a lot of harm if you were to exploit them too heavily. But there'd be lots of opportunities in a landscape that had just much more of the resource in the first place. And of course, you're getting all the benefits in terms of like the soil communities recovering again and productivity coming back into the landscape. Lots more berries for people to go and pick, and lots more berries for wildlife. Bit of a ramble there, sorry.
Yeah, that was great. Thanks, James. And there are projects exploring this. One example is Cairngorms Connect, for instance, looking at basically ways that we as a society can work with the landscape again and accept that we are part of it, not separate from it. And part of that is looking at the social and economic opportunities and balancing that with the environmental needs. So I definitely recommend checking them out. Just to end, I've kind of got 3 questions, but I think they'll be shorter, James.
Okay, go for it.
So first one is any of this research available anywhere, or will it become available to people?
It's not currently available. Fiona can maybe speak to that a bit better than I can at the moment, but the intention is to get some of this information out there once we've
there are a couple of questions on here which I've answered in the text. Similarly, we're currently working on how best to get the findings out there. Even just doing webinars like this is actually one of the really good ways to do it, because there's lots of complicated things to it, and it's actually really good to be able to talk it through and people ask questions and us to be able to answer them to get some of the messages across, because it's all quite complicated. And we do have some considerations with things like data confidentiality from some of the places that we've surveyed. So in terms of it being like a full published analysis, I think that's unlikely, but we will get out on the website and in other ways as much of the learning from the project as we can, even if we can't get out, as it were, all the raw data. So that's, like I say, we're working on it, but that's probably where we're at just now.
Great, thank you. And related to that, what are the next steps after the publication of after the release of the report to the landowners? Oh,
okay. So once we give a report to landowners, then I kind of that's Fiona's stuff. She talks to them and does that. So you want to speak to that, Fiona?
Yeah, so we've kind of got two things going on together here, which is that this analysis that you've just heard about from James is all of the data we collected from all the sites, all brought together in one place, and then we were able to look at it as a whole. But actually, as we were going along, each individual survey of each individual pinewood was put into a small report. Well, I say small, it was still a pretty weighty bit of work that James did specific to that pinewood, and that was given to each landowner and manager. So they were given a copy of that, and we tried to engage them in having a conversation and a bit of a chat about their pinewood. Some people were dead keen to hear our ideas and get involved and take on board what we say. Some people were less keen. But you speak to lots of different people, everybody comes at it in different ways. So there was a variety of responses, but one of the main parts of the project was to try and engage with all the individual owners and managers. And like I say, we had some success and some not such big success, but that's the way it goes. So that's how it went.
Great, thank you. And the very last one, James, this is probably the most difficult question of the night. What's your favourite Caledonian Pinewood remnant?
No, I can't. Like, I like different places for different reasons, so it's hard. I think one that immediately springs to mind is Glenloy, and it has a beautiful Gaelic name, which I probably won't be able to pronounce. It's something like Qualia Udichin. I've probably absolutely murdered that. But anyway, it's an incredible pinewood. It's owned by Forest and Land Scotland. Glenloy is near Fort William, and some of the old pine trees there are just huge and beautiful. It was probably a wood pasture site in the past, so the trees show evidence of being worked. They've got axe marks on some of them, but they're still standing. And it's a lovely mix of trees in it as well. There's oak in there, and there's some lovely blaeberry rich ground vegetation. I definitely would recommend Glenloy, but yeah, there's a lot of contenders. They're all pretty special.
Thanks, James. Thank you, James and Fiona, for answering those questions brilliantly. We managed to get through a fair few there, but apologies to the people that we didn't manage to answer their questions. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Huge thanks to James for a brilliant presentation. If anybody has got any suggestions for future webinars, feel free to put them in the chat. And thank you for all the lovely comments that you've been sending in. It's really, really great to hear how much people have been enjoying this webinar and our previous ones as well. And hopefully there will be many more.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Thanks again, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your evenings.
And this will be available on YouTube, will it, Kat?
Yes, good point. It will be available. Yeah, a couple of people have asked that as well. So all of our previous webinars are on the YouTube channel. I'll just put the link in the chat again, but I will send it around by email as well. As soon as the recording of this one is ready, I'll let everybody know so that you can rewatch or share it. And if you want to hear about future webinars, the way to do that is you can follow us on Eventbrite where you book tickets. You can follow us on Facebook, and it also gets sent out to our mailing list. So you can get in touch on the website if you'd like to join that.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.